There's a belt of plate boundaries that wraps around the Pacific Ocean, and it is responsible for more of the world's violent earthquakes than anywhere else on Earth. The pattern is stark. While most of the planet experiences occasional tremors, this ring unleashes megaquakes, tsunami-generating ruptures, and catastrophic shaking with relentless regularity. It's called the Ring of Fire, and the question is not whether it will strike again, it is where and when. So how does one region dominate global seismic violence while the rest of the world stays comparatively quiet? The answer lies in what happens when slow motion turns into sudden catastrophe. Let me show you what that looks like. On the 11th of March 2011, the seafloor off the northeast coast of Japan began to move. Not gradually. Not in the slow creep that plate tectonics normally follows. In a matter of minutes, a section of the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate lurched upward by several meters and ruptured along a fault interface more than 300 kilometers long, roughly 185 miles. The Tōhoku earthquake reached magnitude 9.0 to 9.1, making it one of the most powerful seismic events ever recorded. But the shaking itself was only the beginning. Because the rupture occurred on a shallow Megathrust fault beneath the ocean, it displaced an enormous volume of seawater. That displacement radiated outward as a tsunami, reaching heights of over 40 meters, around 130 feet in some coastal areas, and sweeping inland with devastating force. Entire towns were inundated. Thousands of lives were lost. And the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, struck by waves that overtopped its defenses, triggered a meltdown that compounded the disaster. What made Tōhoku so catastrophic was not just the magnitude, it was the mechanics. The fault had been locked for decades, maybe centuries, quietly accumulating strain as the Pacific Plate continued its relentless descent beneath Japan. Friction held the boundary in place, absorbing the motion and building stress. And then, in roughly 6 minutes, all of that stored energy was released at once. The rupture propagated along the fault, the seafloor lurched, and the ocean responded. This is what a megathrust earthquake looks like. This is what happens when a subduction zone, locked and loaded, finally fails. And Tōhoku was not an anomaly. It was a textbook example of how the Ring of Fire works, a preview of what locked boundaries around the Pacific are capable of producing. So what exactly is the Ring of Fire? Despite the name, it is not a neat circle, and it is not a single crack in the Earth's crust. It is a belt of plate boundaries that follows the margins of the Pacific Plate and the neighboring plates that surround it. Trenches mark where one plate descends beneath another, while island arcs trace volcanic chains built above those subduction zones, and major fault systems slice through the landscape where plates grind past each other. Off the coast of Sumatra, the Indo-Australian Plate dives beneath Southeast Asia, capable of generating magnitude 9 events and ocean-wide tsunamis like the one that struck in 2004. Along the Cascadia subduction zone in the Pacific Northwest, a locked megathrust sits quietly offshore, while California's San Andreas produces lateral motion on land. In the Philippines, multiple trenches converge in a complex knot where the Pacific, Philippine Sea, and Eurasian plates all meet. From Indonesia to Japan, from Alaska to Chile, the ring stitches together different types of boundaries, but they all share the same underlying engine. The belt overlaps with what seismologists call the Circum-Pacific seismic belt. It is a patchwork of boundaries, and every patch is actively deforming. But what exactly is that engine, and how does it work? The engine that drives the Ring of Fire comes down to two processes working together: subduction and stick-slip friction. And when you combine them, you get a stress machine capable of producing the planet's most violent earthquakes. Subduction is the process that builds the foundation. Dense oceanic lithosphere, old, cold, heavy crust, sinks beneath another plate and descends into the mantle. That creates a trench at the surface and a compressional boundary where the two plates meet. The descending slab does not just disappear quietly, it drags the overriding plate downward, compressing it, warping it, and locking the two surfaces together along a broad interface. And that is where the second process comes in. Stick-slip behavior describes what happens when friction temporarily wins. The plates are in constant motion. The Pacific plate might be moving 8 to 10 centimeters per year, roughly 3 to 4 inches, but the boundary itself can stay locked. Friction holds sections of the fault in place, while the rest of the plate keeps moving. Stress builds. Strain accumulates. The locked interface stores energy like a compressed spring, year after year, decade after decade. And then, when the stress finally exceeds the strength of the fault, the lock fails and the plates slip. The rupture propagates along the interface, and all of that stored energy releases in minutes. This is how megathrust earthquakes work. The largest events on Earth do not happen because the plates suddenly speed up. They happen because broad areas of the subduction interface lock together and then fail as one massive rupture. Subduction sets the stage. Stick-slip friction loads the trigger. And the ring of fire has both in abundance. There is more. It is not just happening at the surface. In most parts of the world, earthquakes are confined to the uppermost crust. But subduction zones produce quakes that descend hundreds of kilometers into the mantle, tracing the sinking slab all the way down. It is a three-dimensional system of rupture, which means the ring of fire is not just shaking more frequently, it is shaking across a far greater volume of rock. What part of the ring of fire interests you most? Let me know in the comments. Those deep earthquakes all share one thing. They happen at subduction zones. Subduction zones come in different flavors. The ring of fire includes both megathrust faults and transform faults, and the difference matters. Not all plate boundaries produce the same kind of earthquake. Megathrust earthquakes rupture the interface between two converging plates. The fault dips at a shallow angle, and when it slips, it often involves vertical movement of the sea floor. That vertical displacement is what makes these events so dangerous offshore. The ocean responds. A tsunami can radiate across an entire basin from a single rupture. Transform faults, by contrast, involve lateral sliding. The plates grind past each other horizontally rather than one diving beneath the other. The San Andreas Fault in California is the most famous example. These faults produce severe shaking near the rupture zone, but because the motion is primarily horizontal, they typically do not generate the same kind of direct seafloor uplift that drives large tsunamis. Both types exist along the Ring of Fire, which is why the hazards vary. Some segments threaten coastal cities with both shaking and inundation. Others deliver catastrophic ground motion without the ocean joining in. We have just seen how megathrust faults differ from transform faults in the kind of motion they produce. That vertical displacement is the key to understanding why subduction zones do not just shake the ground, they can turn the ocean into a weapon. A tsunami is not just a big wave. It is what happens when an earthquake rapidly displaces a massive column of seawater, and subduction zones are uniquely efficient at triggering them. Here is how it works. When a megathrust fault ruptures, the seafloor can move vertically by several meters in a matter of seconds. If the rupture occurs beneath the ocean, that sudden displacement pushes the entire water column above it upward or pulls it downward, depending on the direction of slip. The ocean surface responds, and that disturbance radiates outward as a series of long wavelength waves. As those waves approach shallow coastal water, they compress and amplify, transforming into towering walls of water that can inundate coastlines with devastating force. The Pacific Basin is particularly vulnerable because its size allows tsunami energy to propagate thousands of kilometers from the epicenter, turning a local rupture into a transoceanic event. A quake off Japan can send waves crashing into Hawaii, Chile, and beyond. No event demonstrated that transoceanic reach better than what happened in Chile in 1960. On the 22nd of May, 1960, southern Chile experienced what remains the largest instrumentally recorded earthquake in history. The Valdivia earthquake reached an estimated magnitude of 9.4 to 9.6, rupturing a segment of the Peru-Chile Trench roughly 1,000 kilometers long, about 620 miles. The fault did not just slip, it tore through multiple locked segments in a single catastrophic sequence, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The rupture occurred on a subduction zone where the Nazca Plate descends beneath South America, and the vertical displacement was enormous. Entire sections of coastline dropped by several meters. Others rose. The seafloor deformation generated a tsunami that radiated across the Pacific, striking Hawaii 15 hours later with waves up to 10 meters high, roughly 33 feet, and reaching Japan 22 hours after the quake with enough energy to cause damage and casualties thousands of kilometers from the epicenter. Locally, the destruction was total. Coastal towns were obliterated by the tsunami. Landslides buried communities. A newly formed volcano, Cordon Col, erupted 2 days later, triggered by the massive stress redistribution. The death toll exceeded 1,500 in Chile alone, with additional fatalities across the Pacific Rim. What makes Valdivia so significant is not just the magnitude, it is what the event revealed about the upper limit of subduction zone ruptures. When a sufficiently long segment of a locked megathrust fails all at once, the resulting earthquake is not just larger, it is fundamentally more destructive because of the area involved and the tsunami it generates. Valdivia set the benchmark. It showed what happens when the Ring of Fire operates at maximum capacity. So why does the Pacific Basin dominate global seismic violence? The answer comes down to geometry, crustal recycling, and the concentration of plate boundaries around a single ocean. The Pacific is ringed by convergent margins where oceanic crust is being continuously consumed. Unlike the Atlantic, which is opening as new crust forms along the mid-Atlantic ridge, the Pacific is effectively closing. Old, dense oceanic lithosphere around its edges sinks into subduction zones, creating a rim of trenches and compressional boundaries. That geometry funnels deformation into a relatively narrow belt, instead of distributing it evenly across the globe. And because the basin is so large, it hosts multiple interacting plates. The Pacific Plate itself is massive, but it is bordered by the North American Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the Australian Plate, the Nazca Plate, and others. Each boundary deforms independently, but stress can transfer between adjacent segments. When one section ruptures, it can load neighboring locked zones, increasing the likelihood of cascading failures. The system is interconnected. There is also the sheer length of active subduction. Thousands of kilometers of plate interface are locked and loading strain at any given time. Some segments rupture every few decades, others stay quiet for centuries. But the cumulative effect is a near constant background of seismic release, punctuated by massive megathrust events when long-locked segments finally give way. The Pacific does not just have more earthquakes because it is unlucky. It has more earthquakes because it is built to produce them. Subscribe to keep exploring Earth's most extreme geological systems. The Ring of Fire is not just known for earthquakes, it is also home to the majority of the world's active volcanoes, and that is not a coincidence. As an oceanic slab descends into the mantle, it carries water and other volatiles trapped in its minerals. Under increasing pressure and temperature, those volatiles are released into the mantle wedge above the sinking plate. Water lowers the melting point of rock, triggering partial melting and generating magma. That magma is less dense than the surrounding mantle, so it rises, and when it reaches the surface, it erupts, building volcanic arcs that parallel the trench. This is why volcanoes cluster along the same belt as subduction zone earthquakes. The Andes, the Cascades, the Japanese archipelago, and the Indonesian arc all sit above descending slabs. The concentration is not uniform. Some segments are more volcanically active than others, depending on the angle of subduction, the age of the slab, and the availability of volatiles. But the overall pattern is unmistakable. Subduction does not just shake the ground, it melts rock and builds mountains. With all this volcanic and seismic activity, you might think the ring is constantly shaking, but one of the most dangerous misconceptions about the Ring of Fire is that silence means safety. It does not. In fact, a quiet segment can be more dangerous than one that ruptures regularly. When a major earthquake strikes, it is followed by aftershocks, sometimes hundreds or thousands of smaller events that persist for months or even years, redistributing stress along the fault without necessarily reducing the long-term hazard on neighboring sections. And in some cases, a major rupture can actually increase stress on adjacent locked segments, bringing them closer to failure. A seismic gap, a segment of a known active fault that has not ruptured in decades or centuries, does not mean the threat has passed. It often means the opposite. The fault is still locked and strain is still accumulating. The longer the silence, the larger the potential rupture when it finally comes. Consider the gap between the 1960 Chile earthquake and the 2010 Chile earthquake. 50 years separated them, and both were megathrusts on the same subduction zone, but they ruptured different segments. The pattern of tectonic stress is slow loading and sudden release. That mismatch makes risk feel intermittent, even when it is constant. A city that has not felt a major quake in a century is not safe. It is overdue. That uncertainty, that inability to predict exactly when, has haunted people for millennia. Throughout history, cultures around the Pacific have tried to explain earthquakes and eruptions. Some attributed them to underworld gods or sea monsters stirring beneath the ocean. Others saw them as divine warnings or cosmic battles. These were not irrational beliefs, they were attempts to make sense of real, recurring hazards that shaped entire civilizations. Modern misreads are different but equally persistent. Some people treat the Ring of Fire as a single crack about to split open, ignoring that it is actually many different boundary types stitched together. Others claim that weather patterns or lunar cycles directly trigger major earthquakes, but the physics does not support that. Tectonic stress and frictional failure dominate the mechanics, not atmospheric pressure or tidal forces. The pattern seeking is understandable. When the ground shakes without warning, the human impulse is to find a signal, a predictor, something that makes the chaos controllable. But subduction operates on timescales that do not align with human perception. The engine runs continuously, the ruptures are inevitable, and the timing remains uncertain. So we return to the opening question. How does one region dominate global seismic violence? The answer is subduction and mechanics. Subduction pushes dense oceanic crust beneath neighboring plates, and stick-slip friction locks those boundaries until they fail. Scale that up around the Pacific, and you get a belt that concentrates seismic energy like nowhere else on Earth. Science has early warning systems and rupture models, but it cannot tell us when the next megathrust will hit. That uncertainty will not go away. What saves lives is not prediction, it is preparation. Reinforced buildings, practiced evacuation routes, and communities that take the threat seriously before the shaking starts. The Ring of Fire will rupture again. The real question is whether we will be ready. Which part of the ring fascinates or scares you most? Tell me below and subscribe for more disaster science.